Hey everybody, and welcome to the next video on Greece. And for this one, we'll be focusing on Greek trade and society. Now, the Greeks, as we know, were a maritime seafaring people. Greece did not have a ton of really great farmland, so it forced them to turn outwards. And a lot of them focused on trade in order to be economically and financially successful. And that worked for the most part. Trade equals wealth. Trade brings, yes, it results in cultural diffusion, but people get into trade to make money. And the Greeks were very successful in this. And they focused their trade on luxury items. Now, some of the luxury items we think of as being typically luxury items, such as jewelry. The Greek jewelry was well known throughout the Mediterranean world. But one thing that the Greek peninsula and the islands were good for growing were grapes and olives. So two other luxury items that the Greeks were very well known for was Greek wine and olive oil. And we think of these as being relatively small, kind of in terms of scale, but the Greeks had a monopoly on both of those. And Greek wine and olive oil was sold in the Middle East, in Egypt, in North Africa. Eventually, it would, remain a very popular product into Roman times as well. We still associate Greek olive oil as being a major product from that area. So those were the three major luxury items that they focused on. So it brought prosperity. Trade also brought unity, not only among the Greek peninsula, but among the Greek colonies. Right, here are all of your areas that the Greeks colonized. Drop a pen. Okay, through here on the Black Sea, all around the perimeter, through, Anatolia, what today is Turkey, even along the boot of Italy and Sicily and so forth. And it really kind of, gave the Greeks a connection back to their homeland, to these constant trade networks that they maintained over the years. And, even though there was no nation of Greece and they identified themselves as their individual city-states, they still identified themselves as being Greeks. The Greek versus non-Greek cultural identity was a very important aspect for them. They could be very ethnocentric. They look down upon people who do not speak Greek. The word barbarian comes from the Greek word barbaroi, meaning those who do not speak Greek. So it gave them this sense of unity, this common identity, and that would eventually lead to kind of them getting together periodically for these pan-Hellenic festivals. Okay, Hellenic meaning the Greek world, pan across. And they would have some big, party festivals, like a party for Dionysus, and they had other kind of, games that would come around, like the Nemean Games. But the biggest one every couple of years were the Olympic Games. And they were held to honor Zeus. And you've got some of your more classical athletic events in this. You've got the discus, and then there were running events, and there were wrestling events and javelin throw. And a lot of the events of the early games revolved around displays of, kind of manly warfare and so forth. There was no second place, interestingly enough. There was no, gold, silver, and bronze medals. The winner would get a gold laurel, okay, this kind of crown of leaves that would rest upon its head, and they would be big celebrities, and there'd be all sorts of, financial benefits for them back home and so forth. So the Olympic Games were a big deal, and obviously the tradition is carried over into the modern era as well. Okay, Greek family and society. The Greeks were strictly patriarchal. Fathers had total control over their families. They had total control of their wives and their children. Fathers had the ability to decide whether infants lived or died or not. If they said, no, these are too many mouths to feed, it was legally acceptable for a father to leave a infant, to die, to be exposed to the elements. This kind of patriarchal control was especially true among the upper classes. Upper class women, they were not really allowed outside the home. If they were out and about, they had to have a chaperone. They wore veils. Some of these cultural standards that we typically associate with conservative or fundamental Islamic society, like ISIS or Taliban, that was true of ancient Greece as well. It was a little bit better for some of the other social classes, but not much, because fathers still had total control. But middle class women could run shops, but they were not. No women were allowed to own or inherit property. The lower class women, they usually had to go out and help work the fields or, in their businesses and so forth. But they still were responsible for all of their, kind of womanly responsibilities and duties, such as, being a mother and cooking and cleaning and so forth. It was a little bit better for Spartan women. Spartan women took part in athletic events. They were expected to physically train so that they could give birth to strong warriors. They were allowed to walk about a little more freely, but it was still patriarchal in Sparta. They were not allowed to participate in politics, and they were not full citizens. One interesting aspect of Greek society with women is demonstrated with this woman Sappho. Sappho was a poet of ancient Greece, a very prominent poet, and her life demonstrates two, interesting aspects of Greek society. One, it showed that upper class females were involved in writing. Lower class women, girls were not given any type of education, but some upper class girls were given some education, and because they had so much free time on their hands, they weren't allowed to go out and do anything. They did focus sometimes on literature. So that's one thing. And the other was it showed a double standard that the Greeks had towards homosexuality. Sappho, she was a widow, and she would invite young women to, kind of into her home all the time, and they would write and they would talk about poetry, and they were almost like writing symposiums. But this gave rise to rumors that she was having romantic and sexual relationships with these girls, and she was shunned from society. And what's very fascinating about this is that male homosexuality was very much accepted in ancient Greece. We usually think of it in a modern sense that it should be flipped. But back then, male homosexuality really wasn't a problem, for them, even among soldiers and so forth. Whereas female homosexuality was very much a social taboo. That was a big no-no. So Sappho was, an outcast after that. All right, now slavery. Slavery did exist in ancient Greece. It existed in many forms. You could become a slave through indentured servitude. POWs, conquered people, were slaves. They shipped in foreign slaves as well, slaves from Egypt and Africa and the Black Sea and Central Asia. So you did have a fair amount of ethnic diversity among the slave classes. Regardless of what type of slave or anything like that, slaves were all chattel, meaning they were bought and sold as property, the same as livestock or any type of household property. Now, the majority of slaves worked for physical labor. They were working in fields, or they were working, in mines, or, doing whatever. Some were involved in more educated tasks, and a lot of times that would depend on what type of treatment they got. Physical labor slaves were basically treated the same as animals and livestock, where if you use a slave for bookkeeping, or if you use a slave for running of a business, that usually would result in better treatment, and also would result in the possibility of slaves accumulating some money, possibly even their freedom. That was a possibility, didn't happen very often, but it was not locked in that a slave would be a slave for the rest of his life. There were some avenues for freedom, but generally speaking, that was rare. Okay, so that's just some quick things about society in Greece, and for the next video, we will talk about Greek culture.